Hey everyone, Davey here. Okay, so I'm gonna try to go through this as fast as possible because this is my second time recording this review. I don't know what happened, but my iPod didn't record the entire 25 minute review that I already did this on this week's episode of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. And I'm tired, it's the middle of the night, so I'm just gonna go ahead and just run through the episode as fast as possible while at the same time hitting every point, every important detail about this episode without stopping, without messing up. Let's go ahead and do this. But before I do, I just want to go ahead and comment on just one tiny little detail that I keep forgetting to mention from last week's episode, and that is Talbot. I forgot to talk about Talbot. It was nice to see Talbot show up in person and in front of Coulson and his team and get a good sense of the character, but once again, he was reduced to some form of a cameo. He was literally in just like that one scene and then he was gone. And the scene ended up with him being a bit of a cliched villain. I mean, you can't get any more cliche than grabbing a piece of fruit and eating it while looking over your interrogees and just being like, listen, this is how it's going to go down. You know, he was just reduced to a bit of a cliched villain, and I'm hoping that he gets fleshed out should we see him again in either the season finale or in season 2, should that ever be greenlit. So, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about this week's episode, which is entitled Ragtime. I'm kidding, it's Ragtag. It's called Ragtag. But this week's episode, I feel, was divided into 3 parts. You got everything that's going on with Coulson and his team and them trying to make their moves on Hydra. You got what's going on with Ward and Garrett in the past through flashback sequences, and then what's going on with Garrett and Ward and Hydra in the present. And I think that as it went along, I grew to like the flashback sequences, because when I first saw them, I'm like, okay, you know, I don't know how I'm gonna feel about this. I felt like the very first one that we saw in the cold open was just there for exposition, and I'm like, okay, we kind of don't need to see this. There was no double meaning behind it. It was there showing you like, hey, look, this is what happened. And I was thinking that was going to be the case with the opening sequence of this week's episode for Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. But as it went along, they started to bring it back, and they started to show not only what Ward was all about and how he got molded into the character that he is now, and to give him somewhat of a logical reason as to why he backs up Garrett. Because while watching the episode, I'll admit, I'm like, dude, come on, you could still be a good person. Just like Fitz kept saying, you could still be a good person. But it wasn't until a few minutes after the episode that I thought about it, and I'm like, if I was in his position, I would probably do the same or similar to. And what the flashback sequences also did was also paint Garrett as an actual villain, as an evil son of a bitch. It was in this week's episode where I felt like Garrett was right up there with one of Marvel's, being right up there with Loki and the Winter Soldier as being one of Marvel's good villains, and in a TV show, which I felt like it was the proper medium to introduce him, because I feel like that medium never really gets its fair due when it comes to Marvel. So that's what Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. is all about, and that's what I feel like Garrett did for the show, is to give them a really good villain for them to go up against, which I'm hoping we're going to do in the season finale next week. And it did some really good things to really flesh out that relationship between Ward and Garrett. Now, what I didn't like so much was some of the placing of these sequences was a little choppy. I felt like maybe it could have been edited a little bit better, because there were certain moments where I felt like they were putting scenes right before pivotal scenes that are taking place in present time, just so they can explain something that's going on there. Like, for example, that scene where Garrett tells Ward to take out the dog so that he can detach his feelings easily, so that he doesn't jeopardize Hydra. I felt like I felt like that scene was completely necessary. Don't get me wrong, but I felt like maybe they could have put it in the earlier in the episode, rather than right before the scene where Garrett asks Ward the exact same question. Is that going to be a problem? Is that going to be a weakness? Where he asks Ward to take out Fitz and Simmons, and whether or not he's going to hesitate to do so, which led to a very emotional scene between the 3 of them and what Ward was going to end up doing. And I felt like that scene ended in a good way, but maybe the music was a tad bit too manipulative on the emotional side, but still, I liked the scene. I felt like it was very emotional. It had an awful lot of emotional turmoil. The only other thing that bugged me about the flashback sequences was the casting of young Ward, who looks nothing like him in the present day. And what made it even more embarrassing was that the actor that they got to play young Ward is Ward from 15 years back. And then later on they cut to Ward from merely just 10 years back, which is a 5-year gap. And then they have Brent Dalton, who plays present day Ward, to play 10 years back Ward. And 5 years before that, the kid looked completely different. So it really didn't make sense. And I feel like their casting really flubbed this week with the casting of the young Ward. It just didn't make any sense. But Ward wasn't the only one that was really fleshed out. They actually gave a really interesting detail to Garrett, and they finally revealed what all that metallic stuff was on his abdomen, which was basically Garrett being the first Deathlock back in the 90s. And I felt like that was a very nice tie-in to what all that is going on, and I really do appreciate of how this week's episode brought in things from the pilot with Cybertech and Anthony Quinn, and how they're all connected, just like Coulson was demonstrating that little diagram. Speaking of which, the stuff with Coulson and his team I thought was okay for the most part. It was pretty basic. I don't want to call it generic because that makes it sound like a bad thing, but it was merely just them getting from point A to point B in order to make their move on Hydra. I was kind of hoping for there to be some kind of like I'm coming to get you type of scene, like some type of Liam Neeson kind of scene with Coulson telling Hydra that, hey, next week is the season finale, so we're making the moves on you. And I was hoping to have that in this week's episode, but I understand it for it not being there. It does feel a little bit much more natural, but it would have been badass for Coulson to have told Garrett off through some sort of telecommunications of some kind. And I do feel like some of the earlier scenes with their subplot of how they're coming up with this plan to get back at Hydra felt just a little too cluttered with jokes. I felt like it was just a little too lighthearted. It almost felt like a straight up comedy, but it did lead to some genuinely clever moments in those scenes, mainly around jokes that literally made me laugh. And there were one or two where I can, once again, clearly tell Joss Whedon snuck into the typewriter room and snuck in some of his witty one-liners in there. And man, May looked hot in that outfit. Plus, I liked where it wrapped up, with them in that little basement in Hydra's location in Cuba, and all those super soldiers, those quote-unquote Deathlocks all activated, and I'm definitely pumped up to see where that goes, what happens with that. The only little detail that I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this review up with is Skye and her connection to Reyna that they dropped in this episode. I feel like it's a little too late for that, unless it's just a little seed that they're planning for Season 2 should that ever happen, because for the moment we don't know if there's going to be a Season 2, and if there is, when is it going to take place in, because I'm pretty sure it's going to have something to do with Avengers 2 Age of Ultron, so but if they're gonna take it and flesh it out for the season finale and kind of bring it to the forefront in that finale, I feel like maybe it's just a little bit too late. Maybe if it was planted more like in those first 5 or 10 episodes where, not to sound mean, but compared to the Hydra reveal, nothing was going on, it would have been much more appreciated. So I definitely think that this week's episode was a step up from last week, and I felt like it was much better constructed, with the exception of those flashback sequences in terms of their editing. But much like those flashback sequences, the episode got better as it went along, and I ended up enjoying it much more than last week. So for that, I'm going to go ahead and give Ragtag an 8 out of 10, and it definitely has me pumped up for next week's season finale for Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. So thank you guys for watching. Let me know what you guys thought of this week's episode, and I'll see you guys next week with that season finale review. Take care.